There was a time when cities represented possibility. They were engines of upward mobility, places where ambition met opportunity, where the density of people created a kind of magic, ideas colliding, cultures blending, economies expanding. The city was never just a place, it was a promise. But somewhere along the way, that promise began to fracture. Today, for millions of people, cities no longer feel like gateways to a better life. They feel like endurance tests. Rent consumes half or more of a paycheck. Commutes stretch into hours. Public spaces shrink while private costs expand. And the question quietly shifts from, how do I thrive here? To, how long can I survive this? This didn't happen overnight. And more importantly, it didn't happen by accident. Modern cities are the product of layered decisions, economic, political, cultural, that, over time, have prioritized growth over livability. The metrics of success became GDP, development rates, skyline expansion, but what got lost in that equation was the human experience of the people actually living inside those metrics. Consider housing. In theory, cities should make housing more efficient. More density means more supply. But in practice, housing has become an asset class before it remains a basic need. Investment firms buy up entire neighborhoods. Luxury developments sit half empty while workers are pushed further out. The logic isn't about shelter anymore, it's about returns. And once housing becomes speculative, everything else begins to distort around it. Local businesses disappear, replaced by chains that can afford rising rents. Communities fragment as long-term residents are displaced. Even social trust erodes. Because stability, the ability to know your neighbors, to build relationships over time, becomes a luxury few can afford. But housing is just the entry point. What's happening in cities is part of a broader shift, the transformation of urban life into a system optimized for extraction rather than well-being. Time is extracted through longer commutes. Money is extracted through higher costs. Attention is extracted through increasingly commercialized environments. Even public spaces, parks, sidewalks, transit, are often designed less for comfort and more for efficiency or control. And here's the deeper tension. Cities still look successful. Skylines are taller than ever. Tech hubs expand. Tourism booms. On paper, many cities are thriving. But lived experience tells a different story. Because success, as currently defined, is disconnected from sustainability at the human level. A city can be economically vibrant and still emotionally exhausting. It can grow while simultaneously pushing out the very people who make it function. That contradiction is at the heart of why cities are becoming unlivable. It's not just about affordability. It's about alignment. The systems shaping urban life are no longer aligned with the needs of the people living within them. And when that gap widens far enough, something subtle but profound happens. People begin to disengage. They stop investing emotionally in where they live. The city becomes transactional, a place to work, not to belong. That loss of belonging might be the most overlooked cost of all. Because once a city stops feeling like a shared space and starts feeling like a competitive arena, everything changes: how people interact, how they move, how they think about their future. And maybe that's the real signal we've been ignoring. Not just rising costs or overcrowding, but the quiet erosion of connection. If any of this resonates, if you've ever felt that strange mix of opportunity and exhaustion just walking through a city, then you're already part of this conversation. And honestly, that's what this space is about, thinking a little deeper about the systems we live inside, together. If the first fracture in the modern city is psychological, the erosion of belonging, the second, is brutally tangible. The cost of simply existing, not living well, not thriving, just being there. In many major cities, the math no longer works. Wages have not kept pace with housing, transportation, healthcare, or even basic food costs. And what makes this more insidious is that it's not always visible at first glance. Cities still market themselves as places of opportunity, but increasingly, that opportunity comes with a hidden surcharge: survival itself. This is where the narrative quietly flips. For decades, people moved to cities because proximity meant advantage closer to jobs, networks, and resources. But now, proximity has been monetized. The closer you are to opportunity, the more you pay for access to it. And that access isn't guaranteed, it's conditional. You can live near the center if you can afford it. You can cut your commute if you accept higher rent. You can participate fully if you're willing to absorb the cost. Otherwise, you're pushed outward geographically and economically. And that outward push creates a ripple effect. Longer commutes aren't just inconvenient, they fundamentally reshape daily life. Time, which is arguably the most finite resource we have, gets redistributed away from rest, relationships, and reflection. A 2-hour commute doesn't just take time, it takes energy, attention, and eventually, a sense of control over your own life. There's a quiet exhaustion that builds from this. Not dramatic, not immediate, but cumulative. And over time, that exhaustion becomes normalized. What's striking is how cities have adapted to this pressure, not by reducing it, but by building systems that accommodate it. Food delivery replaces home cooking. Ride-sharing replaces public transit gaps. Co-working spaces replace affordable housing for freelancers. Each solution addresses a symptom, but rarely the cause. Convenience becomes the coping mechanism. But convenience is expensive. And more importantly, it creates a new dependency loop, where the very systems designed to make urban life manageable also reinforce its cost. Think about it. The more stretched your time becomes, the more you rely on paid solutions. And the more you rely on those solutions, the more your cost of living increases. It's a cycle that feeds itself. Meanwhile, something else is happening beneath the surface. Cities are increasingly stratified not just by income but by experience. Two people can live in the same city and inhabit completely different realities. One navigates a network of comfort, short commutes, flexible schedules, access to green space. The other navigates constraint, long distances, rigid hours, constant trade-offs. They share the same skyline, but not the same city. And this divide isn't just economic, it's spatial, temporal, even emotional. Because when your daily experience is shaped by scarcity of time, money, or stability, it changes how you see the world. It narrows your focus. It shifts your priorities. It makes long-term thinking harder, not because people lack vision, but because the present demands too much attention. This is what makes the current trajectory so concerning. It's not just that cities are expensive, it's that they're becoming environments where only certain kinds of lives are sustainable and others are quietly squeezed out. And yet, we rarely frame it this way. We talk about cost of living as if it's a natural phenomenon, like weather, something to adapt to, not question. But these costs are the result of decisions, policies, incentives, priorities that shape who a city is for. So the real question isn't just why cities are expensive. It's who they're becoming expensive for, and who they're no longer designed to include. And if you've ever found yourself doing that mental calculation, what you earn versus what it takes just to stay, you're already seeing the system more clearly than it wants to be seen. That awareness matters, because once you start questioning the structure, it becomes harder to accept it as inevitable. There's a quiet philosophy embedded in modern cities, one that rarely gets stated out loud but shapes almost everything: efficiency over experience. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Efficient transportation, efficient housing, efficient economies. But when efficiency becomes the dominant lens, something subtle starts to disappear: the human scale. Cities begin to function well on paper, but feel increasingly difficult to live in. Take urban design. Streets are optimized for traffic flow, not for walking. Public spaces are minimized or over-regulated. Buildings maximize square footage, often at the expense of light, air, or comfort. The goal isn't to create environments people love, it's to create systems that function, and function, in this context, often means throughput. How many people can move through a subway station per hour? How many units can fit into a development? How quickly can goods, services, and labor circulate? But people aren't units of throughput. We don't experience cities as data points, we experience them moment by moment. The noise, the crowding, the lack of space, the absence of pause. Over time, these micro-frictions accumulate into something bigger, a kind of ambient stress that becomes part of daily life. You might not notice it at first, but it shows up in small ways: impatience in public, shorter tempers, a constant low-level urgency. It's the feeling that you're always slightly behind, slightly rushed, slightly compressed. That's not accidental. It's designed, Because when a city is optimized for movement and productivity, stillness becomes inefficient, lingering becomes inconvenient. Even rest starts to feel like a disruption rather than a necessity. And that has consequences. Public spaces, parks, plazas, sidewalks are where social life happens organically. They're where people interact without transactions. But as these spaces shrink or become less accessible, social life becomes increasingly privatized. You meet in cafes, but only if you buy something. You relax in spaces, but only within certain rules. You gather, but often in controlled, commercial environments. The result is a subtle but profound shift. Community becomes conditional. And when community becomes conditional, it becomes fragile. This is part of why loneliness in cities has risen, even as population density increases. You can be surrounded by millions of people and still feel disconnected, because proximity isn't the same as connection. In fact, without the right conditions, proximity can even amplify isolation. There's also a sensory dimension to all of this. Modern cities are loud, bright, fast, and relentless. Constant notifications, traffic noise, crowded environments. It's a level of stimulation that the human brain isn't fully adapted to handle over long periods. And yet, instead of reducing that intensity, cities often lean into it. More screens, more advertising, more signals competing for attention. Because attention, like everything else, has become a resource to capture. So now, the city isn't just extracting money or time, it's extracting focus. And when your attention is constantly fragmented, your ability to feel grounded, to feel present starts to erode. Life becomes reactive rather than intentional. That's a hard way to live. What's fascinating is that many of these design choices are framed as progress. Smart cities, high-density development, hyperconnectivity. And in some ways, they are improvements. But progress for what purpose? If a city becomes more efficient but less livable, is that really progress? Or is it just optimization without direction? This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because it forces us to ask whether cities are being designed around human needs or whether humans are being asked to adapt to systems that no longer prioritize them. And if it's the latter, then the feeling so many people have, the quiet sense that something is off, even if they can't quite articulate it, starts to make more sense. It's not just in your head, it's in the structure. And once you start seeing that, it changes how you move through a city. You notice the trade-offs, the compromises, the invisible pressures shaping everyday life. That awareness doesn't solve the problem overnight, but it does something important. It breaks the illusion that this is simply the way things are, because it's not inevitable. It's designed, and anything designed can, in theory, be redesigned. Something interesting has been happening over the past few years, quietly at first, then all at once. People have started leaving, not in dramatic waves that make headlines every day, but in steady, intentional decisions. Moving to smaller cities, relocating to suburbs, choosing remote work over proximity, redefining what opportunity actually means. And what's striking isn't just that people are leaving, it's why. It's not always about chasing something better. Often it's about escaping something unsustainable, because at a certain point, the equation we talked about earlier, cost, time, energy, stops feeling like a challenge and starts feeling like a trap. You work to afford the city, but the city consumes what you earn, and in the process, it consumes your time and attention too. So people begin to ask a different question: what am I actually getting in return? And for many, the answer is becoming less convincing. This is especially true in a world where technology has untethered work from place. The original advantage of cities being close to jobs no longer holds the same weight it once did. If you can work from anywhere, then the premium you pay to live in a dense urban core starts to feel harder to justify. Why endure a 2-hour commute if you don't have to commute at all? Why pay triple the rent for half the space? Why stay in a system that feels like it's extracting more than it gives? These aren't just personal decisions, they're signals. Signals that the value proposition of cities is changing. But here's where it gets more complex. Not everyone can leave. In fact, many of the people who keep cities running, the service workers, the essential labor force, the people whose jobs require physical presence, are the least able to opt out. They're tied to the very environments that are becoming harder to sustain. So while some exit, others are left navigating an increasingly strained system, and that creates a new kind of imbalance. Cities begin to hollow out not necessarily in population, but in diversity of experience. Certain groups gain flexibility and mobility, while others become more fixed, more constrained. Over time, that imbalance reshapes the social fabric. Because a city isn't just buildings and infrastructure, it's the mix of people, roles, and interactions that give it life. When that mix starts to narrow, something intangible starts to fade. The energy changes, the spontaneity, the sense that anything could happen, because so many different lives are intersecting in one place. Instead, things become more segmented, more predictable, more managed. And while that might sound stable on the surface, it often comes at the cost of vibrancy. There's also a psychological layer to this shift. Leaving a city used to feel like falling behind, like stepping away from opportunity. But now, for many people, it feels like reclaiming control. Control over time, control over space, control over the pace of life itself. That shift in perception is powerful, because once people stop seeing cities as the default path forward, the entire narrative begins to change. Cities are no longer the unquestioned center. They're one option among many, and options create pressure. Pressure for cities to justify themselves not just economically, but experientially. To ask, why should someone choose to live here? Not out of necessity, not out of habit, but out of genuine value. That's a much harder question to answer than it used to be. And maybe that's where we are right now, not at the end of cities, but at a kind of inflection point. A moment where the old assumptions no longer hold, but the new model hasn't fully taken shape yet. Which means what happens next isn't fixed. It depends on whether cities continue down the current path, optimizing for growth, efficiency, and extraction, or whether they begin to reorient around something else entirely, something more human. And if you've been feeling that pull, the tension between staying and leaving, between opportunity and exhaustion, you're not alone in it. A lot of people are standing at that same crossroads right now, trying to figure out what makes sense. That shared uncertainty, it's not weakness, it's awareness. If cities are becoming unlivable, the real question isn't just why, it's what now. Because this isn't a collapse, it's a recalibration. Cities aren't disappearing, they're being tested. Tested on whether they can evolve beyond the model that brought them this far, a model built on growth, density, and economic acceleration, and move towards something more balanced. Something that doesn't just measure success in output, but in experience. And that shift, if it happens, won't come from a single policy or innovation. It requires a deeper rethinking of priorities. What if housing wasn't treated primarily as an investment vehicle, but as foundational infrastructure for stable lives? What if transportation wasn't just about speed, but about reducing stress and restoring time? What if public spaces weren't seen as optional amenities, but as essential components of mental and social health? These aren't radical ideas. In many ways, they're obvious. But they challenge a system that has, for decades, rewarded a different set of outcomes. Because making cities more livable often means making them less extractive. And that requires trade-offs: economic, political, even cultural. It means slowing certain forms of growth to strengthen others. It means valuing stability alongside innovation. It means designing not just for movement, but for presence. And presence is the key word here. A livable city is one where people don't just pass through, it's where they can actually be. Where time isn't constantly compressed. Where interactions aren't always transactional. Where the environment supports, not competes with the rhythms of human life. That kind of city doesn't emerge by accident. It's built through intention. Some cities are already experimenting with this. Expanding pedestrian zones. Investing in public transit that prioritizes reliability over speed. Creating mixed-income housing models. Reclaiming space from cars and giving it back to people. None of these changes are perfect. And none of them solve everything. But they point in a different direction. A direction where cities aren't just engines of productivity, but ecosystems of well-being. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. This isn't just about urban planning. It's about collective expectations. Because cities, ultimately, reflect what people tolerate and what they demand. If the dominant expectation is that living in a city should be stressful, expensive, and exhausting, then systems will continue to optimize around that assumption. But if enough people begin to question that baseline to expect something better, something more humane, then the pressure shifts, gradually at first, then structurally. That's how change tends to happen. Not all at once, but through a slow accumulation of awareness, conversation, and choice. And that's why conversations like this matter more than they might seem. Because before systems change, perspectives do. Before policies shift, narratives evolve. And right now, the narrative around cities is starting to crack open. People are asking harder questions, not just about how to survive urban life, but whether the current version of it is worth sustaining at all. That's a powerful place to be, not because it guarantees answers, but because it creates space for them. So maybe the future of cities isn't about abandoning them or defending them. Maybe it's about redefining them, reimagining what they're for, who they serve, and what kind of lives they make possible. And if that question sticks with you, if you find yourself looking at your own environment a little differently after this, then stay in this conversation. Not just here, but wherever these ideas show up. Because the more people who start seeing the structure, the harder it becomes to ignore. And if there's one thing worth building, whether it's a city or a conversation, it's something people can actually live in.